This boy William Adams hasn't aged in 400 years. Marty, how did you manage to do that?
It's through the power of whiskey, Justin. I keep telling you, whiskey makes things immortal. It doesn't go off. It doesn't age. It's just a wonderful product. Wonderful. It's the water of life, Justin. The water of life.
Stephen, what was it like working with James Clavell?
That's a excellent question. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity.
No, you aren't really. You're a Japanese whiskey guru.
A little bit of all Japanese spirits, I guess.
We are joined by Stephen Lyman of Honkaku Spirits in Japan. The reason he was flagged up to me is because they've brought out a new whiskey which has been award winning, and it's in a totally, well, it's not new. It's reviving a very brief experiment from a long time ago. Stephen, could you explain what I'm on about? Because I don't really know what I'm on about yet.
You don't know, Marty? That's incredible.
Yeah, so in the late 1800s, the Illinois Whiskey Trust had licensed a proprietary whiskey making method from a Japanese chemist who was living in Chicago at the time. And it was a maltless whiskey that was being made. And they were doing experiments. There was a mysterious fire in the building that was housing the experiments.
Is it
never explained.
By mysterious, do you mean arson?
Could have been.
Could have been, potentially.
Apparently the accelerants that were used in the fire just absolutely gutted the room where the experiments were taking place, and the rest of the building was relatively untouched.
By some miracle.
That's right. And so they did rebuild. They finished their experiments. They actually started production in 1894 at the Manhattan Distillery in Peoria, Illinois. Unfortunately, within 3 or 4 months after the production had begun, the distillery itself went into receivership. It was part of a whiskey trust, and this was the era of trust bust in the United States. And so when the new owners of the distillery took over, they decided to return to malted whiskey rather than this new Takamine process.
Now, when you say maltless, just explain why that's important, because everyone's familiar with the term malt whiskey. So what does maltless mean?
Sure. So rather than using malted grains, which you would use in a malted whiskey, the grains are actually steamed and propagated with Koji spores. So Koji is a mold. It's actually the national mold of Japan.
I love that. I love the fact that Japan has a national mold.
Is this like your cult flavored whiskey?
I don't think so. The mold actually, it's not too much to say that there would not be Japanese cuisine as we know it without Koji.
Yeah.
Soy sauce, miso, mirin, sake, these are all made from Koji.
Yeah.
And so this Japanese chemist had actually, his mother was from a sake making family. So he had learned how to ferment rice to make alcohol. Obviously also a grain, but the difference in the way that the Koji process works is you polish the grains and then you propagate the Koji on the steamed grain. And the Koji actually sacrifices the grain. So it breaks the starches into simple sugars so that the yeast can then convert those sugars to alcohol.
So it acts as a diastase, basically.
That's right.
Now, I know this is quite complex chemistry, but it's breaking down it's breaking down into the alcohol, but the yeast comes on as well. So they work in tandem with each other.
That's right. It's a multiple parallel fermentation. So you have the Koji working at the same time to break down the starches as the yeast is converting the sugars to alcohol. It's happening in the same fermentation.
Now, when you look at the stats for this, now it takes a long fermentation. Normally a fermentation in whiskey is between sort of 2 and 4 days. And at the end of it, you end up with your ABV is sort of 7 to 10, sort of maximum. The Koji and the yeast working sort of side by side creates something totally different from that.
That's right. That's right. Typically the fermentations it's actually a two-stage fermentation. The first fermentation, what we usually refer to as the primary fermentation, is 100% Koji inoculated grain.
Mm-hmm.
And then you will actually add steamed grain to the second fermentation without inoculating any more Koji, because the Koji will still be active in the fermentation and will start to break down the new grain. And you're basically feeding it again. You're giving it a new food source to continue the process. And the whole thing can take 2 to 3 weeks, depending on which style is being made.
So it's up to 3 week fermentation. Now, at the end of this, your wort that's running off, instead of it being 7 to 10%,
it's 18 to 19%.
I mean, that's basically what most distillers get after they do their first run. That's basically the ABV of a low wines. So you're getting that prior to actually distilling. You're at 20% almost already.
That's right.
Now your process that you take after that, you double distill.
That's right. It's a little bit strange, and it has everything to do with Japanese regulatory standards. But that 19% alcohol fermentation is single distilled in a pot still, and then that, which is about 45% alcohol, is diluted back down to 20% with spring water.
Okay.
To get it, and then it's redistilled. Then it's
redistilled,
and then it's back up to approximately 45% alcohol, and that's when it's casked. That's when it's put in a barrel.
It's a very strange process for what we are looking at. But I mean, the Takamine process, there's other people who have used this to make other spirits, and they're reaching, after double distillation, in the high 80%. It seems a very efficient way of converting your grain to alcohol.
That's right. It's, I believe, 2 to 3 times more efficient to use Koji to saccharify grains rather than malting. When one of these fermentations is finished, it's essentially liquefied. The grains are liquefied. You don't have any residual grain.
Yeah.
So you're basically extracting as much of the sugar as you can. That's right.
Yeah, everything goes. Now, Takamine himself, he came from, as you say, a sake background, so he understood fermentation, which more and more, I think lots of people are beginning to realize that fermentation is really the key to all your flavors, because that's where all your flavors created. Everything else is really just additional and addition and subtraction. But he understood fermentation, and he went to the US to do this experiment. Now, I do love the fact that it's called the Manhattan Distillery, but it's based in Illinois. A little bit of marketing. But he went to the US, and tell me a bit about Takamine, because he's a very interesting character.
He is. He was actually the son of a samurai physician, and
so he was busy.
and his mother came from the sake making family. Now, when he was a child, the entire old system of government was ended. So his father lost his status as a samurai. Fortunately, because he was a physician, he could continue to make a living for the family. Well, a lot of samurai couldn't. But Takamine ended up becoming very well educated. He was one of the first graduates of the engineering college at Tokyo University, which today is considered by many people to be the best university in Asia. Mm-hmm. And he ended up working for the government, as a lot of the bright young Japanese were doing at the time. And he was sent on a trade mission to America to go to the New Orleans World's Fair in 1884. And while there, he met and fell in love with an American woman. And he then had to come back to Japan. He had his responsibilities. And what he realized is, if I want this dream of marrying this woman and having a life with her, I really need to become financially independent. And he ended up starting a company to make fertilizer.
Yeah.
And then his mother-in-law, actually, apparently his in-laws really approved of the marriage. And they can, so much so after the couple got married and moved back to Japan, within 3 years, they were back in the States. Yeah. They had been coaxed back to the US by the in-laws, who saw the financial potential of this young man because he was so talented as an engineer and as a chemist. And he ended up, he had all sorts of patents, and they're all, a lot of them are around Koji. He actually made a stomach aid, a digestive aid, because Koji creates amylase and protease, and so it breaks down both proteins and carbohydrates. So if you're a little upset stomach, you took one of these pills, and you'd feel a little bit better.
It sounds a bit like milk of magnesia, which was invented in Belfast.
Blue bottles, that was invented in Belfast. But no, he was the first person to isolate adrenaline.
That's right. That was his biggest contribution to really the world. I mean, adrenaline is a hugely important medical treatment even today. It saved countless lives.
Absolutely.
And it was actually the first time that a hormone had been isolated, that a pure hormone had been isolated in the history of medicine.
Yeah.
So he also paved the way for all of the future scientists and physicians who learned how to do that.
Yeah, I mean,
so
he
was really a remarkable man.
He was a remarkable man. He one of his big things, obviously done a bit of background for this. He really wanted to foster Japanese-American relations, probably on the same personal level. He wanted to make it a national thing, and the cherry blossom trees in Washington D.C. are world famous. You know, you see pictures of them all the time and various things, and he was instrumental in getting those planted.
That's right. He actually made that donation. He didn't want to do it directly as a private citizen, so he worked through the Japanese embassy, but those actually were financed by him and some of his pals in the Nippon Club, which is a private gentleman's club in Manhattan. Actually, the Manhattan, New York City, which he had moved to.
Not the fake Manhattan that he set up in Illinois.
That's right.
But he was so well respected that the Japanese emperor essentially gave him a palace.
Well, he did. Actually, that's right. So the St. Louis World's Fair, they had a pavilion, and there was this gorgeous, traditionally made Japanese, essentially summer palace that was part of the Japanese pavilion. And when the St. Louis World's Fair ended, that was gifted to Jokichi Takamine, and he moved it to upstate New York, which it still exists today.
Wow.
So there's a Japanese palace in New York from a guy who basically made fungus in the alcohol. That's a great
right.
story. It's a great story. It's fabulous. Now, Takamine invented this process. How did it become rediscovered? I know it was patented, but there's a lot of patents in the world.
Sure.
How did it become back again? How do you guys get your hands on it?
Well, Takamine actually, he was this young industrialist in the late 1800s, and on his honeymoon, actually after they got married in New Orleans, on their honeymoon, he studied patent law in the United States.
That must have been an exciting honeymoon. Yeah, come here, Mrs. Takamine. Don't touch me. Hang on, I'm studying patent law here. Yeah.
What he realized is that with patents, you really only had to patent something that was new in the district or the jurisdiction of that patent license. Mm-hmm. Koji fermentation for alcohol has been around for about 1,300 years. You could never patent the process in Japan.
Yeah.
Because every sake maker uses this process to saccharify grains. Every shochu maker, every awamori maker, all of these traditional Japanese alcohols are all made with these Koji fermentations. So it was unpatentable in Japan. But he realized, because of legal loopholes, he could patent it in the US. Mm-hmm. And so it never stopped here. Throughout this entire time, this process has been used in Japan. And so for a Japanese company the Japanese distillery to decide to revive this, they would simply have to adapt what they already know to what they could figure out from what was written in his patent and try to recreate that product. Yeah. And that's what they end up doing. Obviously, the actual formula that was used in the Manhattan distillery for production is not available to anybody, but the patent itself gave enough information to at least try to recreate the style.
Now, there are sort of domestic native Japanese spirits. You mentioned sochu there, and there's barley sochus. The whiskey that you make, is it something akin to a barrel-aged sochu, or what's the difference?
So the key difference, actually, the fermentation processes are quite similar. The difference is in double distillation and then oak barrel aging.
Yeah.
Shochu has to be single distilled by law. So if you want to make authentic shochu, it goes one time through the pot still. And most barley shochu off the still is somewhere in the 42 to 44% alcohol range. It's sometimes aged in oak, but it can't be aged in oak for very long because there are color limitations, which were to actually protect Scotch whiskey.
Yeah.
In negotiations back in the 80s and 90s. And so shochu, barrel-aged barley shochu, really expresses the grain. You taste the barley, even if it has some of the oak character. Yeah. A double distilled Koji whiskey expresses as a whiskey. You do not taste the barley. There isn't any barley expression as you would get from a shochu. They're really, really different products.
Takamine's family, you actually went and asked them for their permission to use this or to revive this?
That's right. We had they very closely protect the Takamine family name from exploitation for commercial interests. And there's a family trust, and based in his hometown where he was born, and the family had never allowed his name to be used for a commercial product before. Outside of the family itself. And so the family actually, one of Takamine's lasting legacies in Japan is he started one of the largest pharmaceutical companies that still exists in Japan. So his family is still quite wealthy.
I was going to say yes, they're probably still fairly influential if push come to shove.
That's right. And so we actually went and explained what we were trying to do, that we were essentially trying to revive this failed experiment of his. I mean, the experiment didn't fail, but it didn't become commercially successful. And they were enthusiastic. They were very happy to lend his name to the product because it is part of his legacy that almost nobody knew about.
Yeah. Now, the whiskey has been very well received. I mean, it's won a couple of awards. How has it went down in Japan? Because I know Japan have their big whiskey industry. So how are they? You're sort of mixing and matching the two Japanese whiskey tradition with ancient Japanese fermentation. So how's that one? You've basically jumped over what the Japanese have been doing.
That's right. It's funny to me, well, to us, that the Japanese native spirits fermentation tradition is not part of the new Japanese whiskey labeling standards. The standards are silent on Koji, but they require 10% malted grain to be included in the mash bill in order to be considered Japanese whiskey.
So this is the new Japanese standards that have been brought in. It actually covers you as well.
It does not cover us because we do not use malt; we use Koji.
Ah, right. Okay.
So the traditional Japanese, the native Japanese fermentation method is not allowed in the new standards. It's not. It's nuanced. It's not explicitly prohibited, but you have to include malt, and we do not include malt.
So what do you say on the bottle in Japan then? This is not whiskey, but it might be.
Actually, we are prohibited from selling it in Japan.
Right.
It's not. Yeah, we cannot sell Takamine whiskey in Japan.
So it hasn't. It just seems very strange that you've basically carried on a Japanese tradition and married it up to, well, a new industry, relatively new industry for Japan, and they're not allowing you to sell it in Japan.
That's right.
That's very bizarre.
It is. There are discussions being had, but I think it's a long road because there are some powerful interests who would not be interested in seeing Koji whiskey become a established category in this country.
So I take it nobody has tried to copy you then?
I think there are things on the way. I expect. I have had conversations with some of the other whiskey importers in the U.S., and it does sound like they, because the TTB labels, the label approvals are public record, and there are obviously very smart people in the whiskey industry in the States, and so they keep an eye on what's coming.
Oh yes.
And the first time that they had ever seen the word Koji on the front label of a whiskey was with Takamine. And I think that turned on all sorts of light bulbs.
Okay. Surprise, surprise. Baby Santori, for example. So it's been very well received. It's won numerous awards.
It won a gold medal at San Francisco. And then I think I'm allowed to say it received 90 points from Wine Enthusiast in their whiskey reviews. But it's early days. I mean, we've been in the market in the U.S. since April.
Yeah.
But the response from the whiskey community has been tremendous.
I mean, it's literally a few months old. I mean, a few months released, and you're winning awards and getting 90%. I mean, it just you have distribution in the US.
We do.
Yes. How available is it in the US?
Right now we're in 15 US states plus DC. We cover over 50% of the drinks market in the US thanks to our distributor Winebow, and we are negotiating with some other state distributors.
Because I know it's quite difficult because each state essentially is a different country with different regulations. So could you name a few of the states that you're in?
Sure. Big markets that we're in Florida, Georgia, the DC area, Maryland, and New Jersey, New York, Connecticut. That's going up the East Coast.
Yeah.
We're in Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin in the Midwest, and then California and Washington on the West Coast. There's a few other states in there. Those are the big markets.
Yeah, so you're coming through. What about Europe and the
UK? We are discussing it. We'd love to come.
We'd love to have you. Don't worry.
Yeah. So yeah, if we're basically looking for importers, distributors to work with at this point. So if you have any leads, we'd appreciate it.
Is it the Japanese overseas that are most interested in this, or is it whiskey aficionados?
It's whiskey aficionados. That's primarily who's interested in Takamine.
I mean, put it like this, for myself, the fact that it's essentially a totally different fermentation process and whiskey making process is something that I really am excited about. That's why as soon as I heard about it, I was like, wow, we have to talk about this. Now there's lots more information, a bit more detail on your website, and people can, if people want to get really nerdy, you can go and look up some of the facts of the Takamine process. But the fact that there's a new style of fermentation that's much more efficient, that has now been rediscovered is really exciting. Now, the Takamine whiskey, tell us about it. It's aged and what?
So it's a combination of virgin American oak and ex-bourbon casks. It's an 8-year age statement, but due to the pandemic, actually, we were delayed a year. So everything in the first release bottle is actually 9 years or older. We just weren't going to try to update the label for that. And one of the things that the Koji gives it is actually umami. And so
umami.
Right, the umami, so it adds a depth of flavor that I think is really unexpected. Now it is bottled at 40% alcohol, which I know is low compared to European standards, even American standards. But remember, it's casked at about 44%. So the dilution is minimal. So I think it really punches above its weight because it's got a lot more flavor than you would expect.
Anybody who knows me, they know I keep banging on this. I don't have a sweet tooth, so there's this sort of push towards sweeter and sweeter whiskies. I did an experiment with Justin a few weeks ago, where I got two bottles of Johnny Walker Red Label, the one you pick off the shelf today, and I have a bottle from the 1960s, and they're nothing like each other. They're just nothing like each other. One is much smokier, much heavier, much oilier. And today's is much sweeter and lighter, and is significantly sweeter. So they're moving in a way with whiskies that I'm not particularly keen on. And as they get sweeter and sweeter and sweeter, it really doesn't affect me. The fact that your guys are getting this umami flavor into it, that excites me, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it does have some sweetness to it, but I think it's quite balanced. With the umami, and there is some. We've gotten such really interesting feedback. It almost tastes like a bourbon in some ways, and I suspect that because most of the barrels are virgin oak.
So with the virgin oak, is that giving you those sort of peppery tobacco notes? That fresh tobacco note that you get off. I always find virgin oak gives a certain spiciness that you have. See, he's okay because it's dead early here, so we can't get a drink. So Stephen's already eating over the bottles.
It's after dinner here, so I'm good to go.
No, well,
yeah, actually you don't get that spicy tobacco sort of expression. The oak itself is so it's a medium char, oak comes from Missouri in America, but the barrels are actually made at the Ariake cooperage in Miyazaki Prefecture, which is about 2-3 hour drive from, I guess 4 hour drive from Fukuoka, which is where Takamine is made.
Ah, dead jealous now. He's getting a drink and we're not.
That's right.
Now, tell me about yourself and your partner Chris, who basically are the company. You do a podcast.
That's right. We have our own podcast. It's called Japan Distilled, and we really try to cover the spectrum of distilled spirits made here in Japan. We've done several episodes on Japanese whiskey, as well as these other expressions of unusual styles. But then we've gone deep into shochu and awamori. We've done one on Japanese rum. We've done some sort of comparisons. What's the difference between sake and shochu, and Korean soju and Japanese shochu, those kinds of topics. And we got a gin episode coming up. So
Japanese gin. This is a big exciting thing. The whole Japanese whiskey industry really took a lot of people by surprise. I think Scotland sat at the pinnacle for such a long time, and then everyone kind of expects Ireland to be there, but the Irish whiskey industry was so small and so almost gone. And the next thing it was actually Japan that, in some ways, leapfrogged Scotland, which took a lot of people by surprise. But the Japanese whiskey it's massive now. I mean, it's just huge.
It's hugely popular, but there actually isn't that much of it available. You still have less than, I think we're probably right around 20 active distilleries in the country right now. And the production volumes are just not very high. And that's the reason that there was a lot of Scotch and Canadian American whiskey being imported to Japan, blended, and sold as Japanese whiskey, which of course not everybody was a fan of that. And that's part of why the new labeling standards came out. But I've heard that here in Fukuoka Prefecture, so there's 47 prefectures in Japan, and I had a conversation with one of our local whiskey bar owners, and he's aware of between 8 and 10 new whiskey distilleries being planned in Fukuoka Prefecture.
Yeah,
just in this prefecture.
These whiskey distilleries are popping up almost like a fungus themselves. They're almost like Koji popping up. Because I mean, you now have about 2,000 in the US. Ireland says it's booming, and we have less than 40. They're popping up in England and Germany and so on and so forth. And Japanese whiskey it's already got the market. It just hasn't have the product. That's why they were having to import so much foreign spirit in, blending it and labeling it as Japanese whiskey. So the markets are already there for these distilleries. So it's in some ways they've already paid for themselves if they can get them up quickly enough, I suppose, and bridge that little gap between supply and keeping up the demand.
Well, I think that the trick is to keep up demand, to make people continue to want it, not go on to the next new thing, right?
Yeah.
But even the distilleries that have been built, the new distilleries that are coming online, they're all small. They don't have they can't ramp up to the volumes that might be needed if Japanese whiskey just becomes ubiquitous like Scotch.
Yeah, I think the price of barley and of barrels is going to go through the roof at some point in the not too distant future. It's an incredible thing. And Japan Distilled is a weekly podcast.
It's twice monthly. It's every other Monday we release an episode. Yeah. We also do a weekly live stream on Facebook and YouTube, also under Japan Distilled. And Christopher and I are actually both published authors. My book, The Complete Guide to Japanese Drinks, was published in 2019, and in 2020 was nominated for a James Beard Book Award, which I was absolutely shocked by as my first book. Brilliant. And then Christopher's wrote the first English language guide to shochu, called the Shochu Handbook, and I believe he published it in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And I have a copy back here. Sorry, it was hiding. So the Shochu Handbook, that's available on Amazon. Worldwide.
Brilliant.
And yeah, so I mean, we are sort of the two weird Koji spirits nerds in the English speaking world, and we've teamed up, and we've both we're working together on this, the Takamine, and as well we will be bringing some shochu and awamori into the U.S. market as well, and we do hope to send those to Europe at some point in the future as well. And then we've got the podcasts, and we're doing everything we can to evangelize for these amazing drinks.
Yeah, it's another aspect of the drinks market that's probably not getting the representation it deserves, and it's great to see you guys flying the flag for it in the West.
Brilliant stuff, Stephen Lyman there from the Takamine whiskey distillery in Japan or in Illinois or in Manhattan, wherever you are. It's a virtual distillery. Thank you very much.
Hankaku Spirits, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.